Morning, everyone. Mr. Murphy is on his way, but in the interest of time, I think we'll just proceed, at least with my opening statement, and then the ranking member will have an opportunity when he gets here to read his own. Mr. Tipton is the normal chairman of this committee. He has a family situation and is home in his district. I agreed to take his place, which I'm pleased to do, but I know he wished he could be here. It's a subject that he's very familiar with and feels strongly about. I want to thank Assistant Trade Representative for taking the time to participate in today's hearing. Mr. Sanford, thanks for being here. This hearing comes at a point in time when we have a number of trade policy initiatives in the pipeline, including the possible renewal of the Trade Promotion Authority, or TPA. In addition, later on today, the President will deliver his State of the Union address outlining his vision and priorities for the upcoming year. I know many businesses are interested to hear if the President will make trade a priority. Last year, our committee held a hearing with a diverse panel of small businesses on their international trade policy priorities and how to best increase exports and create new jobs here in the United States. All of our witnesses stressed the importance of international trade agreements to help grow their exporting capacity and better compete in the global market. They pointed to various multilateral and bilateral agreements as opportunities to open new markets for their products and services. These agreements will help remove complex trade barriers, protect their intellectual property, and streamline the trade process. As you know, the administration has estimated the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or the TPP, will help spur our exports, rapidly growing the Asian market, and create an estimated 3.5 million jobs right here in the United States. Our committee understands the importance of these trade agreements and the opportunities they could provide for small firms. In 2012, my home state of New York exported over $81 billion in goods, which helps to support thousands of good-paying jobs. This brings me to a couple of key points. First, when conducting trade negotiations, the USTR needs to work in close coordination with Congress and small business to ensure that the stakeholders are prepared to take advantage of such agreements. If the administration seeks to renew Trade Promotion Authority, they need to build and gain the trust of Congress and the private sector to ensure that their issues and concerns are being addressed. And second, I encourage the USTR to work more closely with federal and state trade agencies to communicate those opportunities to domestic exporters and to help address their current export barriers. Increasing agency coordination will help support small business firms increase their exports to those countries and therefore create new jobs and hopefully good-paying jobs. Today we will hear directly from the Office of the United States Trade Representative on the status of current negotiations and how they are working to help small firms export. And as I have said before, we need leadership from the administration to make these agreements a priority. We cannot sit on the sidelines while other countries negotiate trade agreements that put our businesses and our competitiveness at a disadvantage. Again, I want to thank our witness today for his participation. I now yield to the Ranking Member Murphy for his opening remarks.
I'd like to thank the Acting Chair, Mr. Hanna, for your opening statement, and I want to wish you a happy birthday. We know you just celebrated that. I appreciate the Honorable Assistant USTR for his presence here today. I'm looking forward to hearing and making sense of what this administration's ambitious trade agenda means for small businesses. With 3/4 of the world's purchasing power located outside the United States, access to foreign markets is no longer optional, but essential for businesses of all sizes to grow and create jobs. Studies consistently demonstrate that when given a fair chance, small business can benefit significantly from trade. Indeed, 98% of U.S. firms that export have fewer than 500 employees. These companies are responsible for fully 1/3 of American-made products that are sold abroad. When small and medium-sized firms are able to take the leap and begin selling their products abroad, there are important, tangible economic benefits here at home. Businesses that export their products abroad create twice as many jobs as those that do not. Workers at globally engaged firms make wages 15% higher than employees of companies that have not reached into foreign markets. In Florida, international trade has long been an important component of our local economy. The Port of Palm Beach, just next door to my district, Florida's 18th district, generates over $261 million in economic activity for the greater region. This includes 2,500 direct and indirect direct jobs related to the port and shipping industries, and more than $12 million in local and state taxes. Statewide, cargo activity associated with Florida's seaports account for nearly 100,000 port-related jobs, supports more than 454,000 other jobs, while generating $24 billion in personal income and $66 billion in business activity. While small businesses are increasingly looking to foreign markets as a growth opportunity, there remain a number of hurdles. The vast majority of small businesses that do export send their products to only one market, often our Canadian neighbors. For small companies to fully reap the benefits of trade, it is important they diversify and tap into rapid emerging economies in Latin America, Asia, and other parts of the world. Small firms that have not yet begun exporting spend months preparing before they start and make significant expenditures, often more than 8% of their operating budget, laying the groundwork. Without the scale and resources of their larger competitors, entrepreneurs often turn to government technical assistance and other guidance when determining how to best capitalize on trade opportunities. In that regard, it is important this committee fully understand how government-managed programs are meeting small business owners' needs. Also, it is important to understand where government falls short or is counterproductive. Whether it is access to capital, research on foreign markets, or similar services, these initiatives must be efficient and effective in helping entrepreneurs compete abroad. With a range of export assistance initiatives scattered throughout different agencies, including the SBA, it is vital that we ensure they are functioning in complementary and not duplicative manner. Likewise, this committee has an important role to play in examining how various free trade agreements impact small firms' export efforts. Too often, trade agreements have made small businesses' needs an afterthought rather than a central pillar of discussion. While small firms stand to benefit from trade agreements that open new markets, an influx of new imports can serve to undermine local manufacturers and producers. Likewise, foreign markets often present a maze of new regulations that are difficult to navigate for smaller companies. It is critical that future trade agreements take into account these difficulties. In a global economy, companies can no longer afford to think only locally. With job creation remaining the top priority for American people, trade and exporting of U.S. goods remains a promising avenue for spurring growth and creating good-paying jobs right here at home. To achieve that goal, export assistance programs need to function smoothly, and any future trade agreements are cognizant of the unique challenges small firms face as they work to sell their products abroad. It is my hope that today's hearing can shed important light on these topics. Thank you again for being here, and I yield the balance of my time.
Thank you. I want to take a moment and welcome some young people and their professors from Colgate University, one of our country's premier universities in my district. Thank you guys for being here. Our first and only witness today is Jim Sanford, Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Small Business, Market Access, and Industrial Competitiveness. In his role, he manages U.S. trade policy activities relating to small exporters. Mr. Sanford has 17 years of experience working for the U.S. government on trade policy. Thank you, sir, for being here. We look forward to your testimony. You may begin.
Thank you. Representative Hanna and Ranking Member Murphy and members of the subcommittee, thank you for convening this hearing and for the opportunity to testify on the work of the Office of U.S. Trade Representative to expand exports for U.S. small businesses. Under President Obama's leadership, USTR is working closely with our interagency partners to help American businesses of all sizes seize export opportunities and acquire the resources necessary to succeed in the global marketplace. USTR is pursuing a robust trade agenda that supports small businesses and broader economic growth by tearing down barriers and creating overseas opportunities for U.S. farmers, ranchers, manufacturers, and service providers of all sizes. We are working to level the playing field so that our workers and businesses can compete and prosper in the global economy. And we're also vigorously enforcing our trade rights and insisting that countries fulfill their commitments. First, the United States currently has in place free trade agreements with 20 countries. These trade deals have broken down barriers and pried open markets for U.S. products from agriculture to manufacturing to services. Secondly, USTR is pursuing new trade agreements that, when combined with existing FTAs, will represent 2/3 of global trade. In the Asia-Pacific region, USTR is negotiating the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP, with 11 other countries: Australia, Brunei, Canada, Chile, Japan, Malaysia, Mexico, New Zealand, Peru, Singapore, and Vietnam. The TPP will cut tariffs and break down non-tariff barriers, resulting in significant economic benefits for the United States. In fact, the Peterson Institute projects that the TPP will generate an additional $123 billion in U.S. exports. The TPP will provide new market access, streamline customs procedures, increase regulatory transparency, and strengthen intellectual property rights protections. These outcomes will be of particular benefit to small businesses. USTR is also negotiating the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, or TTIP. This is an agreement with the European Union. TTIP will be a high-standard, comprehensive trade agreement aimed at strengthening a partnership that already supports $1 trillion in two-way annual trade, $4 trillion in investment, and 13 million jobs on both sides of the Atlantic. In the WTO, we're working to expand U.S. export opportunities around the globe. The recently concluded WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement, once implemented, will reduce red tape and bureaucratic delay for goods shipped around the world. Again, U.S. small businesses will be among the biggest beneficiaries of this deal. USTR is also leading efforts in Geneva to advance negotiations to substantially liberalize trade in information technology products, services, and environmental goods. These plurilateral agreements, once implemented and completed, will help level the playing field and significantly expand opportunities for American technology and services firms of all sizes. Of course, to actively and effectively pursue these initiatives, the administration will need trade promotion authority. We welcome the introduction of the Bipartisan Congressional Trade Priorities Act of 2014 as an important step towards Congress updating its important role in trade negotiations. We look forward to working with Democrats and Republicans in Congress throughout the legislative process to pass TPA legislation with as broad bipartisan support as possible. Third, USTR is pursuing important initiatives in regional fora to address challenges that face small business exporters. In the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, or APEC Forum, for example, the United States and other members are advancing initiatives to assist U.S. companies participate in global supply chains, address localization barriers, and promote greater regulatory coherence. In the Western Hemisphere, USTR is collaborating with other agencies, including the Departments of Commerce, State, and the Small Business Administration, to connect more small businesses to regional partners and to foster entrepreneurship. Fourth, USTR is also vigorously enforcing our trade agreements. The Interagency Trade Enforcement Center, or ITEC, significantly enhances the administration's capabilities to aggressively challenge unfair trade practices around the world. And finally, we're working to communicate more effectively how our trade policy initiatives can benefit U.S. small businesses. Ambassador Froman and the entire USTR team continue outreach to small businesses around the country to highlight export opportunities that we've created and to learn more about the new trade challenges and how we may help. USTR is committed to partnership with other federal agencies to help small businesses compete and succeed in the global economy. Thank you for this opportunity to testify about USTR's efforts.
Thank you. Both Mr. Mulvaney and Mr. Lukemeyer and Mr. Hulskamp, I know that at least two of them have engagements, and I'm grateful that they're here. So in the interest of time, I'm going to ask Mr. Mulvaney to ask whatever question he may have first.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that accommodation. Thank you, Mr. Sanford. Let's skip over TPA and talk about the Trans-Pacific Partnership for a little bit. And I am satisfied that, generally speaking, it's going to benefit small businesses not only in my district but across the nation. generally favor most of the concepts that are contained in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But I want to talk specifically about Vietnam, because when you go down the list of countries that are in this discussion, I don't know much about Brunei, I fully admit that. But I know a little bit about Vietnam, and it seems like this is probably the most closed economy, certainly in the TTIP, and perhaps that we've discussed having a large trade agreement with in a long time. Tell me how you intend to deal with, number one, currency manipulation in Vietnam in relationship to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and number two, with the large number of state-owned enterprises in this communist nation.
Thank you, Congressman. This TPP is obviously a major priority for Ambassador Froman and USTR right now. We're working very hard to conclude that negotiation. Currency is an important issue, and appreciate the interest that Congress and many stakeholders have in this particular issue. This is an issue that we continue to consult with Congress about how we possibly address this within the context of TPP.
Give me some ideas on how you do it, because it's one of the questions I get back home from the folks who are going to now be competing for business in Vietnam, which they like, and they'll be competing with firms from Vietnam, which they believe will make them better. But they keep asking me, Mr. Mulvaney, how are you all going to deal with the fact that these currencies don't freely trade? How do you all propose to address that?
Well, let me say, this is an issue that Treasury is the lead on. So I defer to Treasury. They're part of this discussion that we're having about how we may try to address this. But unlike USTR, where we're developing the trade policy, when it comes to current manipulation and currency issues,
is there any language in the drafts that you've seen that specifically addresses currency manipulation in the Trans-Pacific Partnership?
Not that I'm familiar, but that's not something I'm working on, to be candid with you.
Secondly, the number of state-owned enterprises. It's again, many of my businesses are happy to compete with other folks who are trying to make a profit. Sort of changes the analysis when you're starting to compete with a company that's owned by the government and is not driven by that same profit motive. What protections, if any, are you all providing for in the Trans-Pacific Partnership to deal with state-owned enterprises generally or specifically in Vietnam?
Well, Congressman, as you probably know, there is an ongoing discussion or negotiation on provisions that would apply to state-owned enterprises, disciplines that would, in effect, constrain the activities of these state-owned enterprises. That's ongoing negotiation. But this is clearly a priority for us in the context of TPP with countries like Vietnam. But frankly, it will be a priority for us even in negotiations with TTIP, because our interest is in ensuring that in negotiations we do in the future vis-a-vis third countries that we have these disciplines that we're building up.
Would you agree with me generally, Mr. Sanford, that competing with another profit-based business is different than competing with a state-owned enterprise?
No, I would agree, and that's why we're putting a premium on developing some strong provisions within TPP that could help discipline
I'm going to ask you a brief question about a local issue, which is textiles. In Vietnam, I don't know if you're familiar with it. If you're not, please just tell me. But we're dealing with a situation here where Vietnam wants to institute a new rule called the Single Transformation Rule, which essentially says that they can bring something in from China, possibly heavily subsidized, make a very small change to it, and then export it into the United States under the terms of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Are you concerned about that back door to Chinese, cheap Chinese imports, subsidized imports, and if so, what are you doing about it?
Yeah, obviously textiles is a particularly sensitive negotiation that we're having with Vietnam in terms of the market access. I'm not intimately involved with the textiles negotiations. I have a colleague who's the chief textile negotiator.
Let me cut you off, Mr. Sanford, and I appreciate that. If you don't know, you don't know. I accept that answer. Let me deal with something maybe you do know more about, which is one of the largest complaints I get from small businesses back home when they deal with exporting is something you mentioned in your written testimony, which is the difficulty of dealing with non-tariff barriers. Their stuff gets stuck at the border, and you speak a couple different places in your testimony about what you are doing to help sort of level the playing field, increase transparency. Can you take the last minute of your time, please, sir, and tell us a little bit more about what you're doing to help small businesses in that realm?
Yeah, I think this is something we're trying to tackle in a number of different forms, whether it's TPP. In APEC, we've done some work in terms of trying to come up with uniform documentation, for instance. The WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement, which was just done, is going to provide more transparency in terms of documentation requirements, set certain time frames in which materials need to be or exports need to be released. So I think what I'd say is this is a topic that we recognize as particularly disadvantageous for small businesses, and whatever policy vehicles we may be able to address this in, whether it's a formal negotiation like the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement or TPP, we're pursuing it there, but also in contexts like APEC.
At the risk of overstaying my time, I would simply encourage you on behalf of many members who have spoken to me, make sure that those efforts are real and they have teeth. I recognize the fact we pay lip service to it, and I think that's a good first step. But if we're not actively enforcing the rules on non-tariff barriers, our small businesses will continue to struggle. One of the reasons is they don't export to many countries or many businesses within a specific country. It's just too hard to do.
Yeah, and I guess I was focusing more on the customs angle, but I think the bigger issue is the non-tariff, and that is something, especially when you look at something like the regulatory requirements that countries may have. We recognize this is a fundamental challenge for small businesses, where they may have lack the in-house resources to fully understand what's required in terms of complying with the foreign regulations, let alone getting their product tested. If they don't have guaranteed future exports, there's a sunk cost up front that can deter them from making those kinds of sales. So I just want to emphasize that this is a particular priority for us. We understand that these are challenges for all firms, but things like the customs challenges or a lot of these non-tariff barriers, we recognize these are particularly disproportionately impacting small businesses, and whatever we can do is most helpful for them.
Thank you, Mr. Stanford. Mr. Chairman, thank you again. I apologize for going over time.
No, you're fine. Thank you. Mr. Lukemeyer?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your indulgence. Mr. Stanford, following up on Mr. Mulvaney's questions there, to me, one of the concerns I have is the enforcement. I mean, we can do great things with and I'll get into some questions in a minute with regards to some of the treaties that we negotiate, but at the end of the day, if we don't enforce the provisions of that to protect our people, our companies, especially small businesses who don't have the resources to go out here and take some of these some of the things that are hurting our small businesses, like dumping, for instance, or the currency manipulation. What are you doing specifically to enforce some of the contracts, some of the treaties that are out here to be able to allow the contracts that go on between the small businesses and their suppliers or their purchasers to make sure that there's an even playing field and they don't become taken advantage of, and that the treaty is then worthwhile?
No, Congressman, fully agree. This has certainly been a priority for us to focus more resources on enforcement activities. And I think in the last 4 years or so, there's certainly been an uptick in terms of our enforcement activities at USTR. One thing I would particularly point to, because again, we recognize many small businesses lack the resources to put together the information that's required to bring a case, for instance, is this ITEC, or the Interagency Trade Enforcement Center, that was established a couple of years ago. It's housed at USTR. It's largely staffed by interagency detailees, and we're continuing to expand the resources, the staffing and resources that they have, are particularly helpful in putting together cases. And I think this is a resource that can be tapped more for small businesses that are not able to sort of formulate the cases
Okay,
themselves.
how many cases have you brought?
Off the top of my head, I can't.
One? 10?
No, USTR brings a number of cases. I don't know what the count may be.
We're getting a lot of generalities here this morning, Mr. Stanford. I'd like some specifics. I really am concerned about this enforcement part, because I think I've got a company that's I'm very familiar with it, and we've got a dumping problem, and we can't get it solved. And so there has to be an enforcement mechanism here to be able to allow fair trade that's been negotiated through this treaty, and yet it's not happening. And so what are we doing?
Well, let me make a distinction.
Example of a case that you've taken to whatever court or whatever mitigation group there is.
I'm happy to follow up with you, Congressman, with more details. I think one thing I'd make a distinction is, I think you're talking about dumping cases, and I've been talking about disputes under, say, WTO provisions that.
Well, we'll take intellectual property then. That's another area that's grave concern. I mean, the Chinese are going all over the place with this, and there's a lot of other countries that are getting involved in it as well. I mean, we get information in this committee about the number of attacks on the computer systems of the various companies, and now the large companies, their credit card divisions are being broken into. So IT is an extremely important thing. What are we doing to protect, to push back on some of the countries that are doing these things?
Well, we have the special 301 provision that investigations and that is a trade tool that's available to us. There's an
Are
active.
you executing it? Are you following up on it?
Yes, right now there's a process going forward looking at Ukraine, and there's very strong concerns about their lack of intellectual property protections and.
Are you pursuing a case against them, or are we?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a possibility of taking some trade actions. I don't want to get into the details because decisions haven't been made, but yes.
Are we taking action against anybody? Do you have any actions pending?
Congressman, I'm not the expert on IPR. I'm more than happy to take questions you may have and follow up.
Can you point to any enforcement action, sir, under anything that you're aware of? Are we taking any enforcement action?
We have a number, Congressman, we have a number of disputes in the WTO that are ongoing right now, in IP and outside of IP.
Okay, one more quick question. One of the things that if the President doesn't have trade promotion authority, sometimes I'm wondering, are we playing on the same field when we negotiate contracts, when we negotiate treaties with other countries? Because if he doesn't have that authority and the other country knows he doesn't, are they taking advantage of that from the standpoint that they've got our country over a barrel from a negotiating standpoint?
Well, I think we certainly can continue to negotiate. We'll need the TPA to do the deal at the end of the day. I think that having TPA does strengthen our hand as trade negotiators, so that there's less ability or risk that our trade partners are withholding the final movements they can make, subject to us being able to demonstrate we can conclude.
One more quick question for my time's already expired here. I appreciate the indulgence of the chairman. One of the you have a number of priorities with regards to things that you try and push with regards to small business. Where does ag figure in that list of priorities?
That's part of what we're trying to do.
Is it number 1, number 5, number 10? Where on the list would ag fall within your list of priorities?
I'm not making a differentiation on that. I think one of the things we're trying to do is that we're ensuring that small business interests, whether it's in manufacturing, services, or agriculture, is being reflected in our trade policy activities. And as has been pointed out by the acting chair or ranking member, 98% of our exporters right now are small businesses. So much of what we're focused on is of great benefit to small businesses. We're looking at how we can ensure that we're doing even a better job at that.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Murphy?
Thank you. Again, thank you for your time. I just want to talk just for a minute about some of the barriers to entry for these small businesses, because after the trade deals, it seems pretty obvious that the big corporations have the infrastructure that they can easily take advantage of some of the trade deals. But sadly, it seems that it's our government that's actually become a burden for a lot of the small businesses. And I don't want to argue against the valid role that our government should play in supporting and guiding and even cheerleading for American companies. But what happens when this sort of patchwork of export programs and agencies become too burdensome for the small businesses? And what are your suggestions and ideas for how we could perhaps streamline that going forward?
Well, I think obviously we don't have an export promotion program at USTR. I think our interest is in ensuring that we are linking the trade policy work we're doing with the other federal agencies that have export financing or trade promotion programs, and then doing a better job than linking, as you've noted, to at the state level or the local level about various programs they may have.
So does that happen before the trade deal's done? Does it happen during, after? Are you looking back at some of our previous deals saying, oh, here's how we can improve, and perhaps what are some of those things you've learned?
I mean, it's an ongoing process of consultations with various advisory committees that we have, both from industry as well as state and local representatives.
Do you have like a monthly meeting where you get all the agencies together, or every 6 months?
We have an active interagency trade promotion staff committee that's our full interagency. There's also an interagency that is led more by Commerce on trade promotion coordinating committee, which is more on the promotion side rather than the policy side. We're part of that as well. And they also interface with the states, some of their organizations. So I think there's two steps. One is during, our formulation of our negotiating priorities and our negotiation, we need that active engagement and input from the various stakeholders we have. And then further down the road, in terms of the outreach to make stakeholders aware of the opportunities that these agreements provide, that's another area where we really need to be able to tap into the state and local effort.
We always, on this committee, most committees talk about the burdensome regulations, and I agree with that in most cases. But one of the things that I've really noticed in my 1 year here is that a lot of the agencies aren't even communicating, that they don't talk. So I think we would all be open, Republican or Democrat, to hearing any suggestions you have if we could facilitate those meetings, or any ideas you have to improve that, because I think that would really help a lot of the small businesses.
Yeah, I think, let me point back to the Trade Promotion Coordinating Committee, which has been an interagency process that was established some years ago, and then has had a greater role in recent years after the National Export Initiative was launched 4 or 5 years ago. And I think that, I want to stress, that is an active interagency process, where you have OPIC and Exim Bank and SBA. So you've got various finance elements. You've also got Department of Commerce and its export promotion activities, both domestically and overseas. And there's been a lot of effort to better coordinate those activities. And then I'd say from a USTR standpoint, figure out how we can, if these FTAs are providing the new opportunities, we would like to see the finance agencies and the promotion agencies essentially promoting those new opportunities as part of this process.
Now, as an example, let's talk just briefly about the Colombia Free Trade Agreement. And we were told that this was going to increase labor practices, labor rights in Colombia, but from what I can tell, that hasn't happened to the extent that we were told. What is different about this deal? What are we going to do to improve it so we can actually enforce it? Is it an enforcement issue? Is it because the deal was written too weak? Were there loopholes into it? Was it sequester that defunded some of the agencies that couldn't actually go after? I mean, what can we learn and what can we improve in this so labor practices are improved everywhere, that it's not a race to the bottom?
Well, certainly the labor provisions in any of our FTAs is a priority for us. I mean, Colombia is a relatively very recent FTA, and I think, folks are still working on the implementation of these, ensuring the provisions are being applied. I'm not familiar with what the issues may be there, if there are things that are being investigated or not, but happy to follow up if you have specific questions on that.
Okay. Switching over to ag. It's a very important part of my district and really our country. And while I will continue to still review TPA, I'm interested in whether some of the agricultural provisions have been improved since 2002, and what are the key differences that would mean for some of the Florida farmers. We have a lot of specialty crops, especially citrus.
Well, I think, are you speaking in terms of our active negotiations, or?
Yeah, and what we are doing to improve from 2002 to now.
Well, I mean, obviously, this is a particular export priority for us, the whole area of agriculture. We're working hard to eliminate duties on all agricultural items in our trade deals. That's certainly what we're doing at TPP, and we'll be working to do in TTIP, for instance. What I would stress is that there's even more attention being paid to sort of the non-tariff barriers, the SPS barriers that present some bigger challenges. As you know, even when we can eliminate the duties, doesn't necessarily mean our products have access to that market. So that's where I think we're trying to come up with ways that, for instance, if you look at TTIP, which is earlier on in terms of the negotiation, one of our big challenges there, we're needing to find that science-based decision making. That, as you probably know, many of our we have major products that have been banned for that market.
Right.
And so this is not simply an issue of eliminating the duties, but figuring out ways to discipline the SPS provisions, ensuring there's transparency in the development of these, that we have input into them, that they're science-based. That's a major focus of us right now.
And if you don't know the answer to this, it's no problem. But a lot of my farmers are worried about some of their seasonal crops and some of the perishable goods, some of the tomatoes, things like that. Have there been many has this been brought up in as far as you're familiar with, and improvements with this?
I mean, not specifically, because I don't work on the agricultural items, but I think this is something perhaps the WTO trade facilitation agreement can help as well, speeding up customs clearance and things like this.
And are you familiar with how this has opened up some of the Asian markets for citrus specifically?
Well, the WTO TF was just done, so that's not even implemented at this point. But no, I don't. Sorry.
You don't. Okay. Last question here on infrastructure. You know, we constantly talk about infrastructure, and I think we all agree we need to improve it. And one of the obstacles for our exports is our aging infrastructure. We talk continually about how we need to better use our harbor maintenance trust fund to maintain our ports, and our highway trust fund will soon be unable to meet the demand for road maintenance. Can you talk briefly about the impact of infrastructure and the importance of maintaining it and improving it as far as that relates specifically to trade?
Yeah, I think having a strong infrastructure is fundamental to being competitive when it comes to exports. So I think this is something that is important for us if we're looking to be expanding our exports, that our ports have the facilities to be able to export, that we have the transportation systems in place to be able to transport product from field or factory to port, that we have the infrastructure that allows products to clear customs quickly, things don't get stuck on the dock. I think it's an aspect that also when foreign firms are looking to build plants here, in terms of a judgment of how competitive the place would be. Do you have the adequate infrastructure to support the export of products from the United States? So I think this is tied up in our ability to fully take advantage of the new trade opportunities that our trade agreements yield.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Yulskin?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to visit. I'm from western Kansas, where agriculture is a main export industry, and I want to follow up on a few questions from my colleagues about your list of priorities as the Office of USTR. How do you put together a list of priorities? I mean, these are multifaceted agreements that deal with a wide range of exports, and sometimes certain industries feel like they may or may not meet the list of the top list of the priorities. So can you describe that prioritization process and then where agriculture might fit in that list?
Sure. I mean, I think if you step back, when we're formulating an approach we're going to take in a trade agreement, we have an extensive consultation with the public, put out a Federal Register, get a sense of what the challenge is, what issues our stakeholders feel we should address. We have, congressional mandated advisory committee system, so we consult with our advisors in terms of priorities. There's an interagency process, of course, and very importantly, consulting with Congress in terms of priorities and views and things that you'd like to see addressed in this. And then obviously I've got my political leadership who have guidance they want to provide in this process as well. So it's an active and ongoing consultation process with a variety of different stakeholders, of which Congress is a very important part.
When we look back over actually historical statements from your political leadership and those in the party, there is a real concern that perhaps agriculture is not a main or a top priority. If you're going to pick and choose, let's deal with barriers to other industries that might have more political access. I'm just trying to have you describe exactly where's the biggest potential for export growth, and where do you expect that this would have the biggest bang for the buck in terms of the agreements you're proposing that we move forward on?
Well, I think we're not looking at singling out specific areas. I mean,
but when you negotiate these agreements, that's exactly what you do. These are not free trade agreements in which there are no barriers.
Right.
There are thousands of pages of restrictions and lowering of restrictions. There are winners and losers in each of these agreements. My question is, how do you decide, and where does agriculture fit in that? Because if you look at the export growth, we can talk about a lot of industries, but it's an absolute fact that the export growth that's happening are surpluses because of agriculture. That's the number one arena, and I see it as the number one potential. So what do you see as the potential? Obviously, maybe that's a political calculation. I don't know. I'm just curious, how do you prioritize? And you're asking us, Congress, you want this input. I'm asking, what is your thought process, and where does agriculture fit in that prioritization process?
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, we're a power. The United States is a powerhouse when it comes to exports of agricultural products. We have a comparative advantage, and we negotiate these comprehensive agreements. So, I think to touch on something I was touching on earlier, we're getting to the point where we've eliminated or continue to eliminate many of these duties, and the problems we're facing are really on the regulatory side in many cases. It's the SPS barriers that we're trying to tackle. So, the big challenge we have there is how do we come up with new provisions that can constrain the mischief that some of our trade partners may come up with that are keeping our products out of the market?
I agree, and let me give some specific examples. So, we had this issue with Japan for a number of years.
Sure.
And and finally, we reached an agreement, I think, successfully. But I'm worried about South Korea restricting imports of our beef, current restrictions on meat going into Russia. Can you describe a little bit more of what's going on in those arenas? And certainly, they're non-tariff barriers, and they're not based on scientific standards, world standards, but they continue to fester out there and restrict the ability of American farmers and ranchers to get into places that want to buy our stuff. And so, what are we doing about these two particular countries, and how's that play into these agreements in the future?
Yeah, I'm not intimately familiar. I don't work on agriculture, but obviously now we have Russia that's in the WTO, and they're subject to those new disciplines. It's early on in that process. I know we had some challenges in getting some, I think, beef and some of other poultry with Russia in recent years. I believe some of that may have gotten cleaned up as part of their accession process, but in fact, if there are unjustified measures they're taking, then that's maybe something we need to take a look at in terms of the WTO commitments that they've made. Likewise, we now have in place an FTA with Korea, and if in fact experts need to take a look at these actions or these measures they've taken, but are they consistent with the WTO? Are they consistent with the FTA commitments? That's something we have a tool, and it may be something we need to look at.
I agree. We do have a tool. Frustration from folks that actually raise our ag exports is how long it takes. We're expected to open our markets up to their stuff, and then we spend years trying to sell what is the safest product in the world. And everybody knows the games that are being played there. And my concern is as we move forward, because, again, that's where the potential is. And what I haven't heard from you, though, is to answer that first question. So what's the number one priority? When you look at these, and, again, you're going in a room, you're negotiating hundreds and hundreds of different industries. And if you give her one industry, you take from another, perhaps. I mean, that's the agreement. So I'm just trying to figure out what the thought process is as we move forward and say, hey, I want this authority, and I understand that. I'm a supporter of that, but I don't understand how you prioritize and decide, for instance, in my case, agriculture, but in other cases, how you prioritize those negotiations.
Well, I guess we have objectives we're trying to achieve. They're quite broad. As part of a negotiation, obviously, there are challenges and choices and compromises one must make as you're going forward. But up front, we formulate what our negotiating objectives are, and in fact, that's something we do communicate with the Hill. So there's not some sense of master board and says ag's here and IPR's here. I think to your point, and trying to be responsive, is that during the negotiation, obviously, it's going to depend on the context, and there may be some compromises that one needs to be making.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I might have time at the end, I'd like to ask a couple more follow-up questions. I would like to see that list of objectives, and I haven't heard those here. I think Mr. Lukemire asked a number of questions trying to get a sense of what the goals were, where the greatest potential was. I mean, when the President announces he's going to double exports, but of course, every president says that. They all say that. This is what you're all going to agree on that. But again, there's a lot of hard work there. I have not seen the objectives. I mean, do you have a list of those? Have those been formulated by the administration? And where are those at then?
I guess what I'm thinking of is when we, for instance, launched negotiations to TTIP, we sent a letter with the Hill which laid out what our negotiating objectives were comprehensively, and so that's That's what I'm thinking of. And that came through a
And
deliberative.
how did agriculture fit in that? Was agriculture mentioned at all in the objective?
Of course it was, yes. I don't have the language in front of me, but our objectives would be to eliminate duties on agricultural products and address all of these SPS problems we may be facing.
He's been festering for decades.
Right, and so
with the EU.
Sure.
And they continue to grow every day, and they're non-scientific. I mean, we had this battle with Japan and beef, and we're still, I think, and we have another issue coming with Brazil.
Right.
When the department announced on December 23rd, we're going to start importing beef from areas of Brazil that have foot and mouth disease, and very little discussion on that.
Right.
And so folks in agriculture are wondering where they fit in the prioritization scheme, because, again, there are winners and losers. And I'm a big supporter of open and free trade. But, again, there are losers. I mean, you heard from some of my colleagues, and they want assurances of how you determine who the winners and losers are on these agreements.
Right. I totally agree. You mentioned the challenges in Europe. This has been going on for some time, well aware of that. That's why I think TTIP provides this new opportunity. If we're able to come up with some new provisions, new disciplines that we can extract and impose on the Europeans, then it helps provide more access for U.S. agricultural products and do away with some of the barriers you're facing right now. It'd be more leverage than we have right now.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
You get the message?
Got the message, yes.
There's some deep
I
concerns in agriculture.
I appreciate that.
And a
yes.
number of the questions, which I won't repeat, are associated with that. In my own district, we hear daily about the TPP. It would be easy to be dismissive and say it's misinformation or wrong-headed, but in the absence of real information about it, we don't really do that. The Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement estimates 3.5 million new jobs. However, as I just said, so many of my constituents believe just the opposite. They look at other agreements and they have their opinions about them. Part of the job of the administration is going to be to sell this, right? I mean, that's kind of why it's done the way it's done, because if you open it up to the light of day on a regular basis, you would probably get nowhere, but take a long time to do it. So if you agree with that, how do you unwind all that? What's your plan to sell this plan, not just to Congress, but to small business unions and the American public? I mean, that's an enormous part of this problem.
Right. No, I think there's an enormous education process that's necessary in terms of outreach, and I think that's something that we'll need to leverage all resources to communicate that. As you know, it's an active negotiation. You can't negotiate this in public, so there is always things that people don't know. But there are enormous benefits to this agreement, and we need to continue consulting with Congress, as I think Ambassador Froman's been stepping up and doing more of that, but to work with the stakeholders more broadly. It's been a while since we had a big trade agreement completed, and these agreements tend to go on for a while. I think part of this is people aren't quite sure when this is going to end and when they're going to see some concrete benefits from this. But one of the things we need to do is working with the Hill more, working with our interagency process, working with the stakeholders, and getting the proponents or the beneficiaries of these agreements to be more vocal and to sort of get their views out there as well. So it's not simply those that may be critical of the agreement.
You've seen some of the information out there that we get that we can't find a basis in reality, but people, and I would suggest to you that this is building momentum. You probably sense that yourself. Is that right?
Yeah, I think it varies from negotiation to negotiation. I think there's been much more focus on TPP because that's been outstanding for some time. But we've seen this in the past in WTO in Seattle, if you go back that far. So yes.
You mentioned earlier about labor conditions in Colombia. This might be somewhat of a practical and a little bit of a philosophical question too. How realistic is it for us to expect countries to honor our view of what that means? And how realistic is it for us to actually set out to enforce our notion of what right and wrong is in these countries? And is it a practical expectation? I mean, whether you approve of it or not, is it a reasonable thing to attempt to do in these kind of negotiations? Or you just set out guidelines and hope for the best?
Well, I think it's back to what our negotiating objectives are, and so it's, we're going to continue pursuing, environmental and labor provisions in the agreements that we negotiate. Where we end up on that's a matter of negotiation with trade partners, but that's our objective going in, and we have certain, expectations on being able to deliver on that.
How much do they conflict with one another? I mean, let's be honest. If we know that 95% of the world's population, et cetera, China is middle class is growing. At some point, they're going to demand a lot more of what we do. Of course, they're the world's largest polluter. They have a reputation, as Mr. Mulvaney indicated, this kind of backdoor deals and defiance of intellectual property rules. How do you balance those social issues and in the environment, which is also important? How do you go about doing that in a world where I guess our main goal is to sell goods and services? How do you manage that leverage?
Well, I think you mentioned China, for instance. One of our, China may have an interest in joining TPP at some point. Mm-hmm. So when they join TPP, they're buying into provisions that have been negotiated beforehand. That provides a fair amount of leverage in getting what we want from them. And helps level the playing field.
So you do think you have some opportunities to make some differences on issues that might be more nuanced, or at least you have less direct labor or less direct leverage, because it's not necessarily dollars and cents we're talking about, but only indirectly that.
Yeah, I think so, and I think that it's not the kinds of agreements we're conducting or negotiating. It's not static. We talked about SOEs earlier. Well, that's not something we talked about developing disciplines in the past on. So, there's continuing to be more effort on some of these newer issues like SOEs. In environment, we're doing more. And I think the other thing is that simply rather than just these bilateral deals, when people are looking at potentially joining larger deals like joining TPP or something, then they're having potentially there's more leverage to have them sign on to provisions they would not be willing to do bilaterally with us.
Sure. One last question. In your experience, and this committee is all about small business and the opportunities that you're going to present with these agreements and that lie therein, what are the 3 barriers for small business exporters that you see that you can work out and address through the USTR?
Well, I think it's sort of probably themes. One of the biggest sets of issues that we hear from stakeholders is sort of non-tariff issues, many of which are regulatory. Not understanding what the foreign regulations are, not understanding necessarily how they can demonstrate their products comply with those regulations, not having the in-house resources to figure these issues out, and therefore perhaps passing up sales that they would otherwise have, just not willing to pursue that. That in general is a very large topic, and that's something that we're trying to address in our trade negotiations. Another big issue is simply the SMEs, small businesses, often simply don't know how to take advantage of the opportunities that our agreements provide.
You have a plan for that?
Well, this gets back a bit to the discussions we were having about the TPCC and the interagency process. I mean, I think there's more scope for directing a lot of the finance programs and the export promotion programs, direct SMEs to take advantage of these countries on which we have FTAs with, for instance. The FTAs provide opportunities that are particularly beneficial to small businesses. And I think many of the small businesses aren't making differentiation between countries on which we have FTAs and we don't. and they really provide, there may be very big differences in terms of their ability to sell in those markets. And again, I think that's how having a better interface between the policy outcomes and the promotion works, so that they're working in concert.
When do you think we'll see this agreement?
The TPP? Well, we're certainly trying to get it done in the very near term this year, but I guess what I would stress is that the substance is going to drive the timetable rather than otherwise. And so it's more important that we get the agreement right, we get the provisions we're pressing for,
Sure.
But we're hopeful to get this done early this year.
Thank you. Interesting, in a meeting like this, you can carry on for 4 or 5 minutes and use nothing but acronyms.
It's
Thank you, sir, for being here. As we start to consider various trade legislation and agreements, it's important that the administration keeps our committee updated on the status and impact to small businesses. Will the USTR and the administration commit to periodically updating our committee and how businesses are advancing in trade negotiations? I'm assuming that's a yes answer. It's a
happy to
question.
do that, yes.
We appreciate that. Again, I look forward to working with you and my colleagues in Washington to identify new solutions to assist small exporters. As we've said before, more exports should equal more and better jobs for this country. That's all our goals. I ask unanimous consent that members have 5 legislative days to submit statements and supporting materials for the record. Hearing no objection, so ordered. This hearing is now adjourned. And thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.